A millionaire fires his loyal housekeeper over a theft accusation, but her heartfelt words force him to confront his choices and uncover a deeper betrayal. David Reynolds stood by the grand window of his mansion, overlooking the meticulously landscaped gardens that surrounded his estate. The morning sun illuminated his world of wealth and success, but as he sipped his coffee, a sense of unease crept over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. His thoughts drifted to Maria, the housekeeper who had been with him for over 5 years, a reliable presence in his life amidst the chaos of board meetings and business deals. Maria was more than just a housekeeper. She was a fixture in his home, a warm smile in the early morning hours, always diligent, always kind. She moved through the rooms with an effortless grace, keeping everything in order while caring for his every need. David often marveled at how she managed to juggle her responsibilities while raising her teenage son, Marco, on her own. Her strength and determination inspired him, even if he seldom showed it. On that fateful day, as David prepared for an important meeting, he noticed something was off. A painting, one of his prized possessions, was missing from the gallery. It was a bold piece, a vibrant splash of color that had become the centerpiece of his collection. Panic gripped him as he called for Maria. When she entered the room, her usual bright demeanor was replaced by confusion as he demanded to know where the painting had gone. "Maria, the painting is missing!" he barked, his voice echoing through the high ceilings. She blinked, taken aback. "Sir, I don't know what you mean. I haven't touched it." David's heart raced with anger and frustration. He had always trusted her, but in that moment, doubt seeped into his mind. What if she had taken it? The thought was unbearable, yet the idea lingered like a dark cloud. "You're the only one here, Maria. It has to be you." "How can you think that?" Maria's voice trembled, but her eyes held a spark of defiance. "I've worked for you for years. I would never steal from you." "Years of service mean nothing if you betray my trust," he snapped, unable to control the rage boiling inside him. Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but she fought them back. She had always regarded David as a good man, someone who valued hard work and loyalty. Now she felt the sting of betrayal deep in her heart. "I swear to you, I did not take it. I love this job. It supports my son and me. Please just give me a chance to explain." But David was blinded by his emotions. His mind raced with thoughts of scandal and embarrassment. He could not allow anyone to believe he had been fooled, least of all by someone he had trusted. "I can't risk my reputation over your word. I'm letting you go." The finality of his words hung in the air like a death sentence. Maria stepped back, her face pale. "You can't be serious. I need this job." David turned away, feeling a mix of guilt and vindication. "Pack your things. You're done here." As she stood frozen in disbelief, Maria's heart shattered. She had dedicated herself to this household, pouring her heart into her work while battling the daily struggles of a single mother. Her son, Marco, depended on her. This job was her lifeline, and now it was slipping away because of a baseless accusation. "Please," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper, "I've done everything you've asked. You can't do this to me." But David was resolute, unable to face the turmoil of emotions that her words stirred within him. "I have no choice." Maria felt the ground beneath her shift, her life crumbling around her as she stumbled out of the room, feeling humiliated and defeated. She hurried to her small quarters in the back of the mansion, tears streaming down her face. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the weight of despair settled heavily on her shoulders. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion grew tense. David's meetings were overshadowed by guilt, but he masked it with a veneer of indifference. Each time he passed Maria's empty quarters, a pang of regret pierced through him, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had made a decision, and now he had to live with it. Meanwhile, Maria struggled to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Without her job, bills piled up, and the thought of disappointing Marco haunted her. She felt as if she had let him down in the worst way possible. Each morning, she would wake up early, searching for job listings, but every rejection felt like a dagger to her heart. As the days turned into weeks, David's guilt morphed into a nagging anxiety. Despite the lavish lifestyle he led, a shadow loomed over him. He couldn't shake the memory of Maria's desperate pleas or the image of her tear-streaked face as he dismissed her. He found himself pacing the empty halls of his mansion, surrounded by luxuries that now felt hollow. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, a knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was one of the other staff members, Clara, who had worked alongside Maria for years. "David, can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "What is it?" he replied, trying to mask his unease. "I heard what happened with Maria," she began, taking a seat across from him. "You were too quick to judge. She's a good person. She wouldn't steal from you." David clenched his jaw, defensive. "You didn't see the evidence. It was right there." "Evidence can be misleading, David. Maria loved working for you. She supported her family with that job. You need to consider that maybe, just maybe, you made a mistake." Her words struck a chord. David leaned back in his chair, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. He had never been one to admit fault easily, but something in Clara's voice made him reconsider everything. As he sat in silence, he realized he had to confront his actions, not just for Maria's sake, but for his own. That night, sleep eluded him as memories of Maria flooded his mind. Her laughter, her unwavering dedication. How could he have misjudged her so harshly? The luxurious life he led suddenly felt empty without the warmth of her presence. A realization began to dawn on him. He had lost not just an employee, but someone who had brought light into his life. As dawn broke, David made a decision. He would find Maria and apologize. He needed to understand what had happened, to confront the truth of his actions. But as he prepared to seek her out, a sinking feeling washed over him. What if it was too late? What if he had irreparably damaged the trust that once bound them? With determination, he stepped out of the mansion, ready to confront the consequences of his choices, unaware that the real test of trust and loyalty was yet to come. The days after Maria's dismissal weighed heavily on David. At first, he tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. He filled his schedule with meetings, business deals, and social gatherings. He threw himself into work, hoping that the hustle and bustle would drown out the uncomfortable gnawing in his chest. But no matter how busy he kept himself, her voice lingered in his mind. Her tearful eyes burned into his memory. It wasn't the painting anymore. That was almost an afterthought. It was Maria's face when he had fired her. The disbelief, the hurt. He had never seen her like that. Maria was always composed, strong, the kind of woman who weathered storms without so much as a flinch. That day he had seen her break. Late at night, when the mansion was silent, David found himself replaying the moment over and over. He told himself he had done the right thing. She was the only one who could have taken the painting. But then, why did her protests feel so real, so raw? Why had there been no sign of deceit in her voice? He tried to reassure himself. After all, he was David Reynolds, a man who trusted his instincts, who built an empire with calculated decisions. Yet now, for the first time in years, he found himself doubting his own judgment. Alone in his study, David stared at the empty wall where the painting once hung. The blank space seemed to mock him, as if asking, was it worth it? The conversations with his staff had started to change too. When he passed them in the hallways or during routine check-ins, their voices carried a hint of caution, like they were walking on eggshells around him. It was subtle, but David noticed. Maria had been well-liked by everyone, a motherly figure in the mansion, and now her absence cast a shadow over everything. Clara, the cook, had said it outright. "You judge too quickly." Her words echoed in his mind. What if Clara was right? What if he had misjudged the whole situation? But how could he admit that to himself? He had already acted, already made the choice that had changed Maria's life forever. The thought of being wrong terrified him. One evening, as David sat in his favorite armchair, nursing a glass of scotch, his mind drifted back to memories of Maria. He recalled the first time he hired her, how she had walked into the interview with her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. She had been so different from the other candidates, not just looking for a paycheck, but genuinely invested in her work. She had mentioned Marco during that interview, her voice softening when she spoke about her son, her pride in raising him alone. David had admired that. He had respected her. Now that same woman, who had given so much of herself to his home, his life, was struggling, likely looking for work elsewhere, all because of a hasty accusation. He swirled the scotch in his glass, the liquid catching the light as it spun. Was she really guilty? His mind flickered with doubt. David couldn't ignore the details anymore. Maria had never shown any sign of dishonesty. She had handled his finances, personal items, and valuable possessions for years, and nothing had ever gone missing. Why now? And why this particular painting? It didn't make sense. Frustration gnawed at him. He rose from the armchair and walked to the window, staring out into the vast garden, the same view he had taken for granted so many times before. The silence of the house felt suffocating. Without Maria's presence, there was an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. He glanced toward the far corner of the room, where Maria used to stand quietly, waiting for his instructions or simply tidying up. That small presence had been a comfort, a constant in his life. Now it was gone. Guilt began to creep in. He hated the feeling, but it was undeniable. He had prided himself on being fair, on valuing loyalty, yet he had discarded Maria like she meant nothing. And for what? A painting? His reputation? David found himself sitting at his desk, opening a drawer where he kept a folder with all the employee records. He hesitated for a moment before pulling out Maria's file. Her references had been glowing. Every person she had worked for spoke of her integrity, her dedication. Why had he forgotten that in his moment of anger? He placed the file back and leaned his head in his hands. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. The missing painting, Maria's tearful denial, her long history of trustworthiness, it all began to blur in his mind. Maybe there was something he had overlooked. Maybe his gut reaction had been wrong. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from a business associate reminding him of a dinner meeting the next day. But David could barely focus. He was consumed by the nagging feeling that he had wronged Maria in a way that could never be undone. How could he face her now? How could he even begin to make amends if deep down he feared that he had made an irreversible mistake? David spent the next few days in a haze. Every step through the mansion reminded him of Maria's absence. He missed her efficiency, her quiet competence, but more than that, he missed her presence, the way she made the mansion feel like more than just walls and luxury. She had been the heartbeat of the house, and now it felt cold. At night, he lay awake, tossing and turning, wondering how she was doing. He imagined her struggling to find work, maybe even unable to pay for Marco's school fees. The thought made him sick with guilt. What if she was innocent? What if he had ruined her life based on a rash decision? In the quiet hours before dawn, David would often wander the halls of the mansion, lost in thought. He passed the now empty gallery where the painting had once hung, and the void on the wall seemed to grow larger with each passing day. It wasn't just a missing piece of art. It was a gaping hole in his conscience, a reminder that he had acted without thinking. He had to face the truth. Whether or not Maria had taken the painting, he had failed her. He had failed to listen, to consider her side of the story, and now he couldn't shake the growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. But how could he fix it? Could he even repair the damage he had caused? The burden of guilt weighed heavily on David as he realized that the trust he had so carelessly shattered might never be restored. And yet a part of him knew he had to try, for Maria's sake and for his own. He couldn't live with this gnawing doubt, this festering wound of guilt. He needed answers. He needed to find out the truth, no matter what it revealed. David couldn't ignore the weight in his chest any longer. The guilt had grown too heavy to carry alone, and his nights had become torturous. He needed to confront Maria, not just for his own sanity, but because he owed her at least that much. There was no other way forward. He had to look her in the eyes and hear the truth. The next morning, after wrestling with his thoughts all night, David found himself reaching for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, his breath caught in his throat. How did he even begin a conversation like this? He typed and deleted several messages before settling on something simple, hoping it wouldn't come across as hollow. Maria, I need to talk to you, please. It was a message filled with both desperation and uncertainty, but it was all he could manage. Hours passed without a response. David tried to focus on work, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept checking his phone, waiting for that buzz that never came. The more time passed, the more anxious he grew. What if Maria refused to see him? What if she had moved on, severing the last thread between them? Later that afternoon, just when he had almost given up hope, the familiar buzz finally came. Maria had responded, though her reply was brief. When? David exhaled, not even realizing he had been holding his breath. He quickly sent back a time and place. A small cafe downtown, one she used to frequent on her days off. It felt like neutral ground, away from the mansion that had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong between them. The hours until the meeting dragged by painfully slowly. When the time finally came, David arrived early, as if by being there ahead of her, he could somehow prepare himself for what was to come. The cafe was quiet, the soft murmur of voices in the background doing little to soothe his nerves. He took a seat by the window, hands clasped together on the table as he stared out at the street, watching people pass by, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. His heart raced, the silence of the cafe magnifying the tension in his chest. When Maria entered, it felt as if the air shifted. David straightened in his seat, his eyes locking onto her the moment she walked through the door. She hadn't changed much in the time since he last saw her, still poised, still with that quiet grace about her. But there was something different in her eyes. The warmth that had always been there was now replaced with something guarded, distant. She approached the table, standing across from him for a moment before slowly sitting down. There was no warm greeting, no small talk, just an air of heaviness that hung between them. David could see the pain in her eyes, the unresolved tension that lay beneath the surface. "Thank you for coming," David said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. He hadn't realized how hard it would be to even look her in the eyes. Maria said nothing at first, just studying him, as if she were trying to gauge whether this was some cruel joke or if he genuinely wanted to make things right. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Why now, David?" Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it. "What do you want from me?" David swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat grow. "I made a mistake, Maria. I don't know how else to say it." "A mistake?" she repeated, her eyebrows furrowing. "You ruined my life. You took away everything I had worked for. A mistake doesn't even begin to cover it." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew she was right, but hearing it said aloud made the guilt almost unbearable. He had been prepared for this moment, or at least he thought he had. But now, faced with the full weight of his actions, he realized how deeply he had hurt her. "I know," David whispered, looking down at the table. "I didn't listen. I acted out of anger. I thought—" "You thought what?" Maria cut in, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. "That after years of working for you, of taking care of your home, I would suddenly steal from you? That I would betray the trust we built for a painting?" Her words cut through him like a blade. David clenched his hands together tightly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I was wrong, Maria. I was wrong to accuse you without proof. Wrong to treat you like that." Maria's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. She had cried enough when he had fired her, cried in the privacy of her small apartment, where her son had tried to comfort her, even though he didn't fully understand why she had lost her job. "You didn't just fire me," Maria said, her voice softer now but filled with raw emotion. "You humiliated me. You made me feel like I was worthless, like everything I had done for you meant nothing." David's heart clenched painfully in his chest. The regret, the shame, it was suffocating him. He had replayed that day over and over in his mind, but hearing it from Maria's perspective brought the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. "I didn't mean to hurt you like that," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my pride get in the way. I should have listened. I should have trusted you." Maria shook her head, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "Trust? You never trusted me, David. If you had, you wouldn't have believed that lie so easily. You wouldn't have been so quick to throw me out." David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was right. He hadn't trusted her, not when it mattered most. And now he was paying the price for that failure. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like hours. Maria looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the table as if grounding herself. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. "I lost everything because of you. I couldn't find work for weeks. No one wanted to hire someone who had been accused of theft. And Marco, he had to hear from his own mother that she had lost her job because of something she didn't do. Do you know how hard that was for me?" David's heart shattered at the mention of her son. He had never thought about the ripple effects of his actions, how they had impacted not just Maria, but her entire family. The realization was almost too much to bear. "I don't know how to fix this," David admitted, his voice filled with desperation. "I don't know if I can, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Truly." Maria looked at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time since she had sat down, she let out a shaky breath, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. "Sorry won't bring back the weeks I spent wondering how I was going to pay rent. Sorry won't erase the humiliation I felt." David nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He didn't expect forgiveness, didn't even know if he deserved it, but he couldn't leave things the way they were. "I know it's not enough," he said, his voice trembling, "but I want to make things right, Maria, however I can." Maria stared at him for a long time, her expression softening slightly. "And how do you plan to do that?" she asked, her voice tired, as if she had heard empty promises before. David didn't have an answer, not immediately. He hadn't come into this meeting with a plan. He had just wanted to apologize to try to make amends. But now, faced with the enormity of what he had done, he realized that words weren't enough. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm willing to try. I'll help you find work, pay for anything you need. I just want to help." Maria's eyes flickered with something. Whether it was hope, forgiveness, or resignation, David couldn't tell. She let out a sigh, leaning back in her chair. "You can't undo what's been done, David. But maybe we can figure something out." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. David left the cafe that afternoon with a knot of emotions he couldn't untangle. His heart felt heavier than before, weighed down by Maria's words and the guilt that gnawed at him. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He had to find out what really happened. Maria's name needed to be cleared, and the truth needed to come out. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about Maria either. It was about justice, about uncovering the betrayal that had cost her everything. David began by retracing his steps from the day of the theft. The painting, a rare and valuable piece that had hung in his private collection, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. There had been no forced entry, and none of his other possessions had been taken. It was as if the thief had known exactly what they were after. He recalled the day vividly, the shock, the anger, and the speed with which the blame had landed on Maria. The security cameras had been down for maintenance that day, a coincidence that now felt far too convenient. He had dismissed the idea of an inside job initially, blinded by his own assumptions. But now everything seemed suspect. David started with the security team. He called in the head of security, a man named Carl, who had been in charge that day. Carl was a no-nonsense kind of guy, always on top of things, and David had never had reason to doubt his competence. "Carl," David began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I need to talk to you about the theft." Carl raised an eyebrow. "That was months ago. What's bringing this up now?" David hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm looking into it again. I think I might have made a mistake." Carl leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're talking about Maria, aren't you?" David nodded, feeling a familiar pang of guilt. "Well, I'll tell you what I told you then," Carl said. "There wasn't much to go on. Cameras were down, no sign of forced entry, and the only people with access were you, me, and the staff." David frowned. "What about the maintenance logs? Who was responsible for the cameras that day?" Carl scratched his chin. "It was Tony's shift, I believe. He's the one who handles that kind of thing." Tony. The name rang a bell. Tony had been part of the security team for a few years, quiet and reserved, always keeping to himself. David hadn't interacted with him much, but now something about his name stuck out. He made a mental note to follow up with Tony later. "Anything else I should know about?" David asked, his eyes narrowing as he studied Carl's face. Carl hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. "Look, I'm not one to point fingers, but Tony's been acting a little off lately. Nothing I could report, but I thought you should know." David's gut tightened. "Off how?" "Just jumpy," Carl replied, his tone cautious. "He took a lot of sick days after the incident. Said it was stress-related, but I don't know." David filed that information away, feeling the first threads of suspicion tightening around Tony. It wasn't much, but it was something to go on. The next step was to speak with Tony directly. David arranged for a meeting with him later that afternoon, unsure of what he would find. He hoped he was wrong, that Tony had nothing to do with the theft, but the nagging feeling in his gut told him otherwise. When Tony arrived, he seemed uneasy, his eyes darting around the room as if he was looking for an escape route. David couldn't tell if it was nerves or guilt that made Tony fidget, but the man was clearly uncomfortable. "Tony, thanks for coming in," David began, trying to keep his tone casual. "I wanted to ask you a few questions about the day of the theft." Tony shifted in his seat, wiping his palms on his pants. "Sure, Mr. Anderson. What do you need to know?" David leaned forward, keeping his gaze steady on Tony. "The cameras were down that day, right?" Tony nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. They were scheduled for maintenance." "And you were the one responsible for that maintenance?" Another nod. "Yes, I was." David paused, watching Tony's reaction carefully. "How long were the cameras down for?" Tony hesitated, glancing down at his hands. "About 4 hours, I think. It took longer than expected." David's eyes narrowed. "Was there any reason for the delay?" Tony swallowed hard, his face paling slightly. "There was an issue with the wiring. I had to redo some connections." David's heart rate quickened. Something didn't add up. "Did anyone else have access to the security room while the cameras were down?" Tony's hands clenched together, and for a moment David thought he wasn't going to answer. But then, with a shaky breath, Tony spoke. "Carl came in a few times to check on things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. David's mind raced. Carl? Could it really be him? Carl had always seemed so reliable, so trustworthy, but now the pieces were starting to fall into place. Carl had access to everything, the cameras, the security logs, the house. He had been in a position to orchestrate the entire thing. David felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. Could Carl have been behind the theft all along? Had he used Maria as a scapegoat, knowing David would be too blinded by his anger to see the truth? But before David could dig deeper into the suspicion, Tony shifted again, his face pale with worry. "I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't want to get involved," he stammered. "But there's something else you should know." David's heart pounded in his chest. "What is it?" Tony hesitated again, as if weighing the consequences of his next words. "A week before the theft, Carl started asking me a lot of questions about the security system, how it worked, how to override it. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just being thorough. But now..." David's blood ran cold. This was more than just a coincidence. Carl had been planning this for weeks, and Tony had unknowingly played a part in it. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" David asked, his voice tight with frustration. "I was scared," Tony admitted, his eyes wide with guilt. "I didn't know what was going on, and by the time I realized something was off, it was too late. I didn't want to lose my job." David sat back, his mind racing. He had trusted Carl for years, had relied on him to keep his home and family safe. But now it seemed that trust had been misplaced. Carl had betrayed him, and worse, he had let Maria take the fall for it. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Carl's involvement," David said, his voice low and steady. Tony nodded, the fear in his eyes replaced with determination. "I'll tell you everything, but you need to promise me one thing." David raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Promise me that Carl won't come after me once this is all over," Tony said, his voice trembling. David's jaw tightened. "You have my word." With Tony's cooperation, David began to piece together the full extent of Carl's deception. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. Carl had been planning the theft for months, carefully manipulating the security system and covering his tracks. He had used Maria as a convenient scapegoat, knowing that David's trust in her had already been shaken. The more David uncovered, the angrier he became. Carl hadn't just stolen a painting, he had stolen Maria's livelihood, her dignity, and her future. And David had been too blinded by his own pride to see it. Armed with this new information, David knew what he had to do. Confronting Carl would be dangerous, but it was the only way to bring justice to Maria and to right the wrongs he had committed. As David prepared to face the man he had once considered a friend, he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at him. But this time, he wouldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. This time, he would see the truth for what it was. David had spent too long running from the consequences of his actions. Now, it was time to face them head-on. David stood outside the security office, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and determination. He had uncovered enough to know that Carl was the thief, the man who had destroyed Maria's life and tarnished her reputation. The time for quiet reflection had passed. Now was the moment of reckoning. Carl had no idea David was on to him. David had spent days gathering evidence, piecing together every thread of Carl's betrayal. With Tony's testimony and records from the security system, he had built an airtight case. Now all that remained was confronting the man who had deceived him. As David opened the door, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. The tension, the regret, and the burning desire to set things right flooded through him. Carl looked up from his desk, his face betraying none of the guilt David knew lay beneath. "David," Carl greeted, his voice neutral, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a flicker of unease that David didn't miss. "What brings you here?" David shut the door quietly behind him, his jaw set. "We need to talk." Carl raised an eyebrow, but remained composed. "About what?" David didn't waste time with small talk. "About the painting, about Maria, and about you." There was a brief pause, the room filled with an uncomfortable silence. Carl's expression hardened, his facade starting to crack. "What are you talking about?" David took a step closer, his voice low but filled with the weight of weeks of regret and anger. "I know you stole it, Carl. I know you set Maria up, and I know you've been lying to me this whole time." Carl's eyes widened for just a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "That's ridiculous. You can't seriously believe that." "I don't just believe it. I've got proof," David said, his words sharp and unyielding. "Tony came clean. He told me everything you did to sabotage the security system, and I've got records that tie you directly to the theft." Carl's face paled, his calm demeanor crumbling. For a moment he looked like a cornered animal, desperate for a way out. But then, with a sudden shift, he stood up, his fists clenched, his voice rising with indignation. "You think you can pin this on me?" Carl's voice shook, but it wasn't with fear. It was anger mixed with a tinge of desperation. "After everything I've done for you, you'd accuse me of something like this?" David didn't flinch. "You didn't do this for me. You did it for yourself. You betrayed me. You betrayed Maria. You let her take the fall for your crime, and you had the nerve to look me in the eye and lie about it." Carl sneered, the pretense of innocence slipping away. "And what are you going to do about it? Go to the cops? You think they'll believe you? You think they'll believe her? She's a nobody, David, just some housekeeper." David's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "Maria is not a nobody. She's a better person than you'll ever be. And yes, I'm going to the cops. But first, you're going to admit what you did." Carl laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You're living in a fantasy, David. You think I'll just roll over because you say so?" David stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Carl's. "You're going to admit it because it's the only chance you have left. You're finished, Carl. Everything you've built, everything you think you're protecting, it's all going to come crashing down. And when it does, Maria's going to get her life back." Carl stared at him, his anger giving way to something else. Fear. It flickered in his eyes just for a moment, but David saw it. He knew he had him. For a long moment, Carl said nothing. Then slowly he sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his guilt had finally caught up with him. His voice when he spoke was barely a whisper. "It was supposed to be easy," Carl muttered, his eyes downcast. "I didn't think it would go this far. I thought I thought you'd blame someone else. Maybe one of the new hires. I didn't mean for it to ruin her life. David's stomach twisted with disgust. You didn't mean for it. You framed her, Carl. You stole from me and then you destroyed her. Carl buried his face in his hands, the enormity of his actions seemingly crashing down on him. I was in debt. I didn't know what else to do. I needed the money, and that painting, it was worth more than anything I could have gotten from you. David shook his head, anger flaring again. You had choices, Carl, and you chose to hurt an innocent woman because it was easier for you. Carl looked up at David, his face pale and lined with regret. I'll tell the police. I'll admit to everything. Just don't ruin me completely. David felt a bitter satisfaction rise in him. You ruined yourself the moment you decided to do this. Carl didn't argue. He sat there defeated as David walked out of the room, feeling the weight of the confrontation lift off his shoulders. But as much as the truth had come out, the damage was far from undone. David wasted no time in contacting the authorities. He handed over all the evidence he had gathered, and Carl was swiftly taken into custody. The painting was recovered from a hidden storage unit Carl had rented under a false name. It would take months for the legal process to unfold, but David had done his part. Justice was finally in motion, but there was one more person he needed to make things right with. Maria. David stood outside Maria's modest apartment, his heart pounding harder than it had during the confrontation with Carl. This was the moment he dreaded most, the moment he had to face the woman whose life he had destroyed with his mistrust. The guilt that had weighed on him for weeks threatened to suffocate him now. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments it opened. Maria stood there, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. There was a flicker of something in her expression, wariness, perhaps, or maybe even fear. David could hardly blame her. Maria, he began, his voice faltering, I don't even know where to start. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Maria's expression didn't change. She just stood there, watching him, waiting for him to continue. I know what I did to you was unforgivable, David continued, his voice breaking. I didn't trust you. I didn't believe you. And I let you lose everything because of my arrogance and pride. He took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. Carl was the thief. He framed you to cover his tracks, and I didn't even consider the possibility that you were innocent. I should have trusted you. I should have known better. Maria's face remained impassive, but David could see the pain in her eyes. She had every right to slam the door in his face, to tell him to leave and never come back, but she didn't. I came here to tell you that Carl's been arrested, David said softly. Your name is going to be cleared. You'll get your job back if you want it. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, Maria. You don't deserve any of this. For a long time, Maria didn't say anything. She just stood there, her arms folded across her chest, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she let out a breath and shook her head. I don't need my job back, Mr. Anderson, she said quietly. I don't need anything from you. David's heart sank. He had expected this, but it still hurt more than he thought it would. I just needed to hear that you believed me, Maria continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I didn't want your pity or your guilt. I just wanted the truth to come out. David swallowed hard, nodding. I believe you, Maria. I should have believed you from the start. There was a heavy silence between them, one that seemed to stretch on forever. David felt the full weight of his mistakes in that moment, the pain he had caused, the trust he had broken. He wasn't sure if Maria could ever forgive him, but he knew that he had to try. I'm sorry, David whispered, his voice barely audible. For everything. Maria looked at him for a long time, her expression softening just a little. Then with a small, sad smile, she nodded. Thank you for telling me the truth, she said quietly. That's all I needed. David felt tears sting the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He had come here to make amends, and while he couldn't undo the past, he could at least start moving forward. As Maria closed the door, David stood there for a moment, feeling both the weight of his guilt and the lightness of finally doing the right thing. Trust had been broken, but perhaps in time, it could be rebuilt. David walked away from Maria's apartment, a changed man. He had lost much in the process of finding the truth, but he had gained something far more valuable, an understanding of the power of trust, kindness, and the importance of making things right, no matter how late the apology came. As he left the building, David made a vow to himself. He would live differently from now on. He would be a man worthy of the trust he had once so carelessly discarded. And while he couldn't erase the past, he could forge a new path forward, a path built on integrity, humility, and the knowledge that true redemption comes not from erasing mistakes, but from learning to live better in their wake. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of trust, betrayal, and redemption. If you were moved by David and Maria's story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Don't forget to turn on the notifications so you never miss a new video. Your support means the world.